Hello and welcome to the new episode of As If podcast with me, Lisa Fevral. And today we're going to talk about a bunch of things. I hope that we're gonna get to cover than what I think we're gonna get to cover. Today we're talking about Superflat. I asked before I started this podcast on my channel, my main channel, I asked you guys what you wanted me to talk about in regards to art, and one of the questions was about the art movement of Superflat. It was from Chloe Cho. Do you know about the art movement Superflat, and if yes, what do you think about it? I've known about this art movement for a long time, but I definitely had to go back and kind of revisit some of the things that I already knew about it. I've seen Takashi Murakami's exhibitions before, but I have very conflicting, maybe conflicting is not really the right word, as much as on a personal level, I don't think I have a lot of good things to say, but on the level of just talking about art theory and whatever, I somewhat understand why it's been a conversation. However, I think that there's kind of a lot of gray area, or at least a lot of things that I find kind of suspicious about everything that is part of the Superflat movement. So we're gonna have to talk about all of this today. I'm gonna have to cover a lot today. I'm gonna hope that it makes sense to all of you guys in terms of why I feel this way about this art movement, and also hopefully we get to talk about Witch a little bit, which is the Italian cartoon that I was really into when I was younger. I might separate the Witch part and do like a double feature Witch and Winx and talk about that. But we're gonna find out what's gonna happen by the end of this podcast, because we're gonna see by the time how long this is gonna run, you know. Let's talk about art.
Yeah, she's a full-on Monet. It's like the painting, see? From far away it's okay, but up close it's a big old mess.
So Superflat, we cannot really talk about Superflat without talking about Takashi Murakami, a pretty famous artist. You've probably seen his work. He's the one who coined the term in, I believe, 2001. You've probably seen his art in either somewhere in your local galleries if you live in a pretty big city, or you've seen it on clothes, some of the designer brands. It's usually some kind of flower or very bright pattern. If you Google his name, you're probably gonna be like, oh yeah, I've seen his work before. And the thing with his art is that he is kind of a very conflicting figure. I think that in the art world, there's a lot of reading into artworks going on in terms of critics giving their opinions, and oftentimes those opinions being guided by desire to give more credit than what's due. I wouldn't say that it's always the case, but I do think that it's kind of the case in many cases of art movements and people who coin terms, people who become like the figureheads of movements. Oftentimes those people are not really the figureheads as much as they just got kind of lucky in terms of exposure at some point, and sometimes they're not even the ones who started something. But in case of Takashi Murakami, I would say that it's not that he is not the one who started it or something. It's not what I'm going to be criticizing about him today, to be quite honest. To define what Superflat is, we should talk about the manifesto that has been released when Takashi created an exhibition with a bunch of artists, when he coined the term. The way that Takashi goes about explaining it is by talking about its flatness in terms of visual representation, which takes a lot from the Edo period, from the traditional prints, Japanese prints, and especially ukiyo-e, this type of treatment, of the work. And if you want, you can just look up Hokusai, which is this artist that you've probably seen his work, The Great Wave. It's like a very famous Japanese print. And one of the things that Murakami is talking about when he's talking about Superflat is the fact that this type of style where the line and color are above depth perception, it's kind of a very traditional thing in the Japanese society. That's what he's suggesting at the very least. He's also talking about how this traditional way of approaching art, this prints, this flatness that's inherent in their works, it is also similar to anime, or rather manga, in a sense that manga is definitely a continuation of what the print industry was like in Japan. That's why there's a lot less difference between high art and low art, because the low art of manga was created through these beginnings of traditional print, which was considered high art. However, that high art was also very much available to everybody. It wasn't that expensive to buy print because it's a print, you don't have to paint it anew every time. So that was one of the things that kind of blurred the lines in the past in Japan. What's high art and what's low art. And Takashi Murakami is kind of arguing that there is no difference between low art and high art, and that Superflat is somehow uniquely Japanese, which in some ways I do agree with that, because of course the traditional prints, they were from 1800s, and if you compare those prints to the Western art history at that point, there is a big difference in terms of what was considered to be representational or what was considered to be art, or what the general art group of the avant-garde artists in the country were doing. Woodblock printing wasn't that big of a thing in the West, if it even was used that widely. And I think that through this comparison to pop art, I think that Murakami was trying to make it a little bit more accessible in terms of theory to understand where he was going with it. However, I don't think that there's that much correlation going on, because pop art was all about breaking those rules of using low art and elevating it to high art, oftentimes causing this wave of criticism going towards artists because it wasn't, high art. It wasn't made by the artist, for example, with the case of Andy Warhol, right? So a lot of people, like the way that Murakami is talking about it, seems like it's less about trying to say that this is high art now, or that it's low art, or whatever. I feel like the whole conversation is less about that, as much as it's just referencing the fact that it's not coming from pop art as much as it's coming from the traditional Japanese art, and is influenced by the consumerist culture that was thriving in Japan at that point, which is also the case with pop art in terms of consumerist culture, but I think that the way that he's trying to frame it in a different way, which this is where I think his theory falls apart a little bit. So for example, Takashi Murakami has stated that a lot of his works are about post-World War II Japan, and that it's about consumerism, it's about this obsession with the Kawaii, which is, it's technically, if you translate it to English, it means cute, but a lot of people who are like art historians who are talking about Superflat, they try to make this distinction between cute and kawaii, because kawaii implies that there's this feeling that you think that something is cute because it's weak or pitiful, or it seems to be in some shape or form requiring your help or assistance. It's a little bit of like a complicated term. I will link a lecture where this art historian is talking about this specific Superflat artist Yoshimoto Nara, and I'm gonna link that in the description, because I think that if you really want to dive deeper into this whole kawaii part of Superflat, I think that you're going to benefit from watching that, because it specifically talks about Yoshimoto's work, which with Yoshimoto, I think that he is a little bit... Oh, sorry, Yoshitomo. I don't know why I said Yoshimoto. Yoshitomo. With him, his work is a little bit more about that relationship between kawaii and what makes it not so kawaii, like basically making it kind of not pitiful, for example. So for example, in some of his paintings, there's this use of features that are usually considered to be cute. So for example, he would paint a girl that has really big eyes and really round face, and her body is really small, which is usually considered to be attributes of what is considered to be cute. But then when you look at his image, the way that this person in the image is looking back at you is in no way making you feel like they're pitiful or in need of your help. So this kind of kawaii structure is kind of breaking a little bit. So with him, it's a little bit more about that specifically, and about childhood trauma and things like that, rather than consumerism and post World War II Japan, like with Takashi. So when I talk about Takashi, I find him confusing, because he's definitely showing a lot of the otaku culture, right? Which is, otaku culture is like basically a very obsessive way of consuming media, mainly anime and manga. The way that they kind of describe it in America, it's a little bit different, because a lot of people who started to watch anime or manga when it wasn't like a very mainstream thing would be called otaku, because it was really confusing to people why they were into it. While at the same time, in Japan, this word has a lot more of a negative connotation. So because there has been a lot of examples of exploitative kind of parts of that subculture, I think that what otaku means to Japanese people is a little bit different to Westerners, because for the Japanese, it's not about consumption of anime and manga, it's about the obsessive nature of it. In many ways, obsession with the like having a Lolita complex, it's part of the whole thing. It's also very niche kind of interests, oftentimes fetishization of those very niche interests, and it's difficult to really define it as somebody who's outside of that culture. However, like, I've talked to a bunch of people who are familiar with it, and this is what they were saying. They were saying that otaku has a really bad connotation in Japan, and sometimes I guess maybe it does in the West, but I don't think that people in the West know enough about that to kind of signify something more than just being confused by people's fascination with this specific country's media, right? In any case, a lot of this Superflat artists they're kind of confusing to me. Okay, so for example, let me just tell you a bunch of things that kind of make me feel a little bit uneasy about Takashi Murakami, and things that kind of seem to redeem him in some way. So for example, first of all, he sells like some kind of work that he's created for a lot of money to like a private collector or a gallery or whatever it is. And then he creates merch with the same print, which kind of devalues his original work in some way, because the original work was printed, for example, on the same material or like it's just a print, for example, technically, but just one of them was sold for a lot of money and the other one was sold for very little money. So it kind of, this devaluing is very interesting, which I think could be seen as an act of in some way purposefully devaluing art, just so those people who are really rich don't feel like they have something in their possession that's like so cool or whatever. At the same time, he is producing it in his factory, which even his artworks that are technically the originals are not produced by him, and it's not really a criticism of him as much as I find it really strange the way that I couldn't find anywhere where he got the funds to do it. Okay, so because if you look at his biography, it states that he's like, his parents weren't rich. I believe that his dad was like a taxi driver or something like that, and his mom had a work that kind of at the store or something like that. So it was that kind of labor that doesn't really produce a lot of money. And then all of a sudden he has this university degree from Tokyo University, which I would assume would be expensive. If it's not expensive, I don't know how the Japanese system is working, right? He still got to Tokyo. Oh, I'm sorry. He still got to New York, and then he managed to have this factory, have other people make his art. I cannot even imagine, as an artist myself, like who's technically supposed to be in the same monetary category as him, right, in terms of having like funds to create art. I am really, really confused as to how, like, where he's got the funds for his first factory, because it's not that he as an artist created a non-profit organization, or that he created an art collective that they kind of work together or whatever to create shows. It was definitely more of a relationship of he's creating a label. So for example, he created a factory first. Then that factory became sort of like a label for artists who are his students in a way. They make his artworks, but he's also coaching them on how to make art and like helping them create their own careers, you know, in the art world. And it's really confusing to me how he went from that financial status to being able to open up a factory, because it was quite early on, the same way as the thing is, the Superflat show was in like 2001, and then subsequently there was a couple more, but before then he created a factory well before then. This is what is very confusing to me. He was only 34 years old, a Japanese man his parents are like allegedly that he didn't have any money. Where did it come from, and why wasn't it like exposed anywhere or talked about anywhere? It's really interesting to me. I've been like looking everywhere because there's some allegations of him not paying them well, the people who work at the factory, and I think that it's just a little strange that he kind of jumped from one position that's so far off from the position that he is in right now, and there's no concrete steps that usually are discussed publicly when someone goes from rags to riches, right? It's just really interesting to me that I couldn't find any information that was reliable or that was in any way explaining how he even got to New York and then got to have all of those shows in America, especially considering that he's saying that a lot of people outside of Japan, the way that they see contemporary Japanese art is like they don't really want to see it. Like basically he was saying that there was no interest in it because people don't see Japan as a powerful nation anymore, I guess, which is really weird the way that he talked about it. Let's actually talk about the second part that he kind of explained, the second point of his explanation of what Superflat is. He oftentimes explains it as the World War II, the post-World War II world, the post World War II culture of Japanese people. And it's really, really confusing the way that he's talking about, because it is extremely Japan focused in a way that completely shuts off the effects of globalization. So, for example, his point is basically that Japan started to be obsessed with, that's how he's saying that the Japanese people got obsessed with kawaii things. They got into innocent things and fetishization of those innocent things, and created this whole culture around it, because they were infantilizing themselves and were being infantilized by others from the outside world, like international, influences, which is quite questionable, because his kind of explanation is that people were really traumatized by the bombings, right? The resolve of the World War II. And that's why this whole otaku culture was created. That's how it bloomed, that's where it got its beginnings. And I think that this interpretation of why this culture exists is in a way misguided. That's from my perspective. I'm not saying that it's 100% true. It's just, I think that this particular part of his theory, to compare to his theory where he explains the background in Japanese wood block printing, this second part where he explains the conceptual ideas rather than visual aspects of the works, I think that it kind of starts to fall apart and unravel a little bit in a way that makes his theory a little bit wonky, based on his manifesto, based on his writings, his theory about Superflat. If what he's saying is that Japan created this otaku culture or became infantilized by the US or infantilized by themselves as a result of trauma, it kind of makes it sound like Japan was in some way excluded from the rest of the world in terms of trauma, that they kind of had their own unique circumstances, where in reality the whole point is that it's a world war. Many people have been completely devastated by that war. A lot of people in Europe had that war happen on their land. A lot of things were destroyed, and a lot of things required rebuilding. There was a lot of trauma because people lost their lives. There were so many people that lost their lives in that war. And to say that Japan was the only one that was traumatized sounds a little strange, I'm not gonna lie. As well as it kind of doesn't really make sense in terms of like cause and effect, right? Because if he's saying that this obsession with cuteness and innocence came from trauma and being like, and trying to immerse yourself into this world they've created, then why didn't it happen in the same kind of way in every other country? At the same time, there is this globalization point, right? So the export of a lot of Japanese art, a lot of Japanese like mangas and anime started quite early on in terms of the timeline. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people started to like have some manga and some anime experiences in like 80s and stuff like that, especially in America. Every one of us, at least out of the people that usually watch my videos, have seen Sailor Moon. Sailor Moon came out in like the 90s, 92, 93 to like 95. So saying that people, that there's no obsessions like that in other countries with cuteness and innocence would be a misunderstanding of patriarchal society and its obsession with women's innocence. In the same way as otaku men are obsessed with young women that are extremely sexual, however very innocent and seemingly unaware of their sexuality because they are literal children, which is a whole... We're not even gonna go there because it's gonna piss me off. But the way that this kind of relationship between those men and their obsessions is formed is exactly the same as the obsession that society as a whole has with women's virginity, with women's innocence in general. It's the way that he's talking about this is as if this is something new, which seems a little bit strange considering that this is the fundamentals of some of the feminist works that were trying to address these issues before he coined the term superflat and defined it in very direct terms, you know. It just seems like this point specifically is definitely falling apart when you start to look into it. Another thing that I want to talk about, I'm going to bring up some artists and talk about specifics, you know, because even though Murakami's factory right now has, for example, I believe that there's like 7 artists right now that are like studying with him, that are not his assistants only, but they're also his students and also get to, like, you know, participate in a lot of art shows and whatever. I believe that there's 5 that are women now, which was really very male dominated before, in the beginning of his whole career as a, you know, art manager, art label, you know. And even though that's true, a lot of their works seem to not actually be in any way feminist, which is really confusing, because you would think that in this type of movement, in Superflat, where a lot of the theory is relying on this fetishization and stuff like that there would be a lot of artists who would be addressing it. There are a few. There are some performance artists who are talking about it, some photographers that are talking about it, and we're going to talk about them in other episodes of this podcast when I'm going to be addressing specific like photography, you know, issues, or episodes where I'm going to be talking specifically about one artist in particular. Today, because we have so much to cover, I'm going to kind of talk about multiple things just to introduce them to you. So for example, I would like to introduce you to this artist, Chiho Aoshima, and this artist is kind of within this shoujo culture. Shoujo is specifically focused on girls. If you translate shoujo from Japanese, it means girl, but it's also very specific in terms of not being in any relationship to anybody else, because there are other words that exist in Japanese that mean woman, girl, you know, but they have this relationship. Like, for example, maiden is something that puts you in a category of somebody who is in the dating realm, you know, or is eligible woman for marriage or whatever. Or there's another word, I don't remember what it is right now, but it's more specific to being like a mother, you know. But shoujo is separate from this whole world of relationship to men in some capacity, which makes it kind of like a unique genre, especially within Superflat, because shoujo is definitely a genre in anime and manga, which just means that it's something that's for girls. It's kind of a confusing subgenre, because there are some artists that they kind of say that they are not feminist. When they're asked if their art is feminist, they kind of say no, which is fine, I guess, but I do think it's a little strange. And then, but I understand that it's a cultural thing too, because it's just not accepted in Japan that much. But considering that they're working outside of Japan and they're working in America mostly, that's where I think it's kind of a little bit strange. In Chiho Aoshima's work, this femininity and girlishness, it's one of the things that are celebrated in her work. It kind of in themes, it overlaps with third wave feminism in many ways, mostly because these shoujo worlds, are written almost entirely populated by women. So oftentimes you would see that their paintings, for example, or their prints, or whatever medium they're using, they don't really have any men in them. So it kind of creates this separate bubble within a very aggressively, violently patriarchal society where you could exist outside of the relationships with men. Takano Aya, for example, also another artist that you can look up just to look at her work. This kind of genre definitely helps to expand, the world of the girl space, of girl consciousness, and have a little bit more room to just be a human being rather than being a girl to relation to other people. And then there's also this artist Sawada, which we're going to talk about her a little bit more in photography. She creates multiplications of identity. So she basically changes her hair or something, and like her outfit, and she plays different characters where in reality she's the same person. And there's sometimes she's kind of playing into being somebody else a little bit more. Sometimes it's about the fact that if you look from afar, it looks like a bunch of different girls, but when you look closer, you realize that it's just the same girl over and over again. There's a lot to look into when it comes to the shoujo culture, specifically in the Japanese art. But those artists that I like, we're going to talk about them separately a bit more in the future. I want to talk about what I think is kind of negative parts of Superflat in terms of trying to understand it and trying to make sense of why a lot of the images in Superflat movement involve so much over-sexualization, especially of women. There is this sculpture that Takashi Murakami made that was of I guess it's like it's an anime figure, and it's a man, it's a boy. This work is called My Lonesome Cowboy. You can look it up. I will give you like a little bit of a quote just so you can kind of imagine what it looks like. So this sculpture depicting an anime figure shows a life-size naked boy masturbating, and his white skin in stylized spirals swirls around him like a lasso, forming a jagged shape above his head that is both oddly weaponized and plane-like. There's also another one which is called Hiropon, and it was made in 1997, just a year earlier, which depicts a woman with oversized breasts and a spray stream of milk encircling her figure. Definitely the relationship between him showing a lot of like over-sexualized images, it relates to current over-sexualized images that are in anime and manga. It also references back to ukiyo-e, to this Japanese tradition, woodblock printing. But most of all, I find it really confusing why a lot of people see this as in some kind of way a critique of otaku culture. I think that Murakami himself said that it's not a critique. He's he says that he's an otaku himself, which I think that we should take his word for face value in this case, because I don't think that there's that much merit to what he's doing, specifically in those works that are over-sexualizing people, mostly women. I could only find one over-sexualization of a man, which should tell you something about him. In many ways, I think that specifically all of these works are kind of failing to subvert the expectation or comment on it in a sufficient way visually within the work to make it successful conceptually. What I mean by that is, I think that you're gonna understand my point more if I talk about a very extreme version of what Takashi Murakami has done before, which is Makoto Aya. Cannot stand him. That one I can tell you I cannot stand him. This artist, he is oftentimes portraying really violent images of schoolgirls and shoujo girls, girls that are not mothers, nor are they dating yet. Like, I guess like quite young girls, right? Already gross. I know that art involves a lot of images that could be upsetting, a lot of conversations that can be seen as taboo. I understand that. I've seen a lot, in my 4 years of university, I've seen a lot of art. He created this image of a girl that's being essayed by something that looks like a dragon, but in a way, the way that the dragon is spiraling around the figure, it reminds you of the octopus. Why I'm mentioning this is because octopus is actually this image that refers back to hokusai and back to the tradition of ukiyo-e, where hokusai made this print of a pearl diver girl having an encounter of sexual nature with two octopi. All right? Yeah. So hokusai made that print. It wasn't clear whether it was a say as it is with this guy with what's his name again? I always forget it because I tried to erase him from my memory. Aida Makoto. In the case of Aida, this girl is definitely being essayed and K-worded. Alright? It's not a great image. And he is known to be obsessed with this whole like Lolita thing, with the whole shoujo thing. I find him quite basically, there's some people who talk about him and they kind of go, well, he is within the tradition of Superflat. On the website, if you look at Takashi Murakami's friends and personal connections on the art story, where you kind of, it's like public knowledge of like who's influencing who's working together, who knows each other, blah, blah. Makoto Aida is one of the people who he is connected to. That's why I'm kind of bringing him up while talking about things that kind of peeve me about Superflat and about Takashi. So Aida is within this whole group, within having flat inspired images, within referencing ukiyo-e, within talking about otaku culture, and the way that sometimes critics try to read his work is say that he is aware of his male position within the world in terms of the privileges that come with it, and that he is exaggerating in one way or another the effects or the power that men can have on women in this power and balanced structures, and that he's kind of like commenting on it through exaggeration. Now listen, I would say that in the case of Makoto Aida, I would say that it's definitely a no from me. I do not believe that he does any of those things, because if we would have been in this, like in a studio together, if we would have been in a critique together with other artists, I can tell you for sure that this wouldn't fly. At least it wouldn't fly in any normal setting with artists who are giving each other critiques, because the most important thing about an artwork is the intention and execution relationship. He is making art about a topic that is extremely graphic and violent, and he is part of the group of people, i.e. men, i.e. Japanese men, that inflict those violent things on those girls, i.e. Japanese girls, right? And portraying something in this ridiculous graphic way does not redefine this relationship between those power structures, two people, or two groups of people that are involved in this conversation. It doesn't do anything new to subvert this kind of relationship. There is nothing that you can do on canvas that's violent that hasn't been done in real life at one point in time. As a man, sitting down and going, you know what? I have this fantasy that I have in my brain, and I'm gonna blow it up to this ridiculous proportions. I'm going to paint it or print it on a massive canvas and it's going to make me millions is kind of sickening, to be honest. The only way I would be able to understand this work with all the references to all these octopus situations and hokusai and ukiyo-e and Superflat and everything is if in this image, in this very violent image that references all of those things, instead of that girl, he painted himself. That would change the relationship. It would change the expectation, or rather change the way that you're looking at the realities or the history of Japan and sexism and stuff like that, and would actually suggest something new in this conversation where you would go, oh, that's interesting to have a fantasy that something happens like that to you instead of being done to somebody who you're attracted to. He is this I found this article from Japan Today when I was researching this guy, and like, oh girl, this article made me so angry yesterday. I thought I was gonna throw something or throw someone through the window. This guy who interviewed Aida Makoto, like, it's a guy, his name is Ryan Roth, and he just kept on calling him the most talented artist. It's just, there's so much. I'm gonna link, should I link it? I don't even know if I want to platform them in any way. Yeah, I'm not going to, but I'm just gonna tell you that a lot of people read this, they try to give this terrible works of this terrible man that literally tell you, he said before that he's attracted to young girls. He said that he doesn't act on it, but he is attracted to them. There's some point where, for example, one of the quotes is, it's true there is a video of him masturbating for some time, which was filmed at an exhibition in New York City, and it's true many of his works are based around sex in young girls. And then this guy, after saying all that in the same sentence, he goes on to say, with that said, he's one of the most controversial and talented artists in the world today. Where's the talent? Where's the talent conceptually speaking? Because obviously you cannot be subjectively the best artist in the world. There's going to be multiple people who are on the same skill level of whatever medium he's trying to master. Conceptually speaking, because this whole article is painting him to be a genius, explain to me, where is the power of the conceptual work? Because it's not there. If this guy were to walk into any classroom in any university, present his work, and say what he says about his work, he would not get a good grade, that's for sure. He would not get a good critique, like a positive, favorable critique, that's for sure too, because his concepts, regardless of his the message or the images that are within the work, his concepts are extremely weak. They are holding on to his fantasies, his fetishization, his violent ideas of what is appropriate or inappropriate and what he would want to see on a canvas or on a massive blown up print. And it has nothing in the visual symbols in his work that would suggest some kind of either critique, subversion, or anything else. So the way that we should be referring to artists like that is not a genius, or, oh, he is a person who is commenting on consumerist sexual culture in Japan, but rather as a part of that culture, who perpetuates that culture, who participates in it with such glee that I do not think that there is a single critical thought in that man's mind when it comes to gender relations. In any case, I just want to kind of point you to this side of the Superflat, because the way that it's oftentimes talked about, it does position those people as geniuses in some way, of some shape or form. I just wanted to point out some of the inconsistencies or faults in the theories that Takashi Murakami has presented, while at the same time show some of the artists that are working within this framework that kind of benefit from people associating them with the Superflat and the new Japanese wave, Take everything with a grain of salt, I'm gonna link in the description that video, that lecture. I believe it's for LA, either museum or some kind of gallery, but it's definitely very well done. But the critic, the woman that's giving the lecture, sometimes she's talking about them in more of a favorable light than I would like her to. She states it herself at one point. She says that I might be reading, like giving it my own feminist reading of it. I might be giving it a little bit too much credit, which I think is exactly what they're doing oftentimes. I think sometimes you just have to look at the artwork, look at the person, who they associate themselves with, who they are inspired by and who they inspire, what they say verbatim, instead of trying to assign meaning to their work that they don't deserve. They don't deserve that much consideration, I think, especially people like this artist that I told you about at the very end. And I think that it is important to just not give them that credit, basically. Just who cares? They didn't create anything new, they didn't create anything worthwhile. With Takashi Murakami, it's a little bit more complicated, just because he did at least present some type of theory. He presented a collection of works of his own and of other artists, and he at least tried to do something with it, However, I'm still very skeptical of him just because of his association to all of these artists, specifically this artist that I told you about. I'm skeptical because of the sculptures that he's made. For some reason, he thought that a guy's sperm floating around is like in some kind of way similar to the girl's boobs producing milk and milk flying around. Like, what do you think women just have spontaneously milk in their... The anatomical issues aside, it's still stupid and still kind of meh. Like, it's like I can see where he's going with it, but he definitely was trying heavily to lean on the World War II themes, but those themes just don't work. And there's one point where he literally says, let me find this quote because I really was just like, holy crap, like this can't be real. Here's a commentary for that work called Hirapon, which is that woman with the milk. So the quote is, however, beneath its cartoonish and seemingly vapid surface, the sculpture functions as a crippling critique of post-World War II Japanese culture. Murakami repeatedly states in his interviews and writings that Japan was infantilized by the US presence following World War II, that it became the little boy in comparison to the US. Murakami still states that following the end of the World War II, Japan was kept from participating fully in global politics. Japanese aesthetic/political impulses imploded into fantasies of monsters and superheroes, galactic wars, cyborgs, and schoolgirls, the displays of anime, manga, and video games. He describes this as having a castrating effect on Japan, and as a result, Japan culture became obsessed with youth, cuteness, and with it came a darker and violent sexual manifestation of his obsession. I'm gonna end this podcast by telling you that I think it's extremely misguided and disrespectful, to be honest, of a Japanese man to say that he thinks that Japan was in some way castrated after the end of the World War II, and that it became unable to participate fully in global politics, and that's why they became obsessed with youth, cuteness, and whatever. Because I think that with the whole issue of comfort women, if you don't know about it, look it up. I might do a podcast with one of my friends who makes art about comfort women. With the whole, like, with all the things that Japan has done in Asia, it is quite strange, at the very least, to describe the World War II effects this way without considering anybody else in the world. Anyway, think about it yourself and tell me what you think about it, because to be honest, when I was doing this, like, compiling all this information, I got more and more confused about what I would actually like to say about it, because it's not that I would discount it as a movement, because there is some theoretical threads that make sense, but there's a lot of things that don't actually seem to be very well thought out. And I believe that unfortunately a lot of art movements are going to have some of this nonsense involved in it, especially things like, for example, surrealism. We'll get to surrealism. You're gonna hate me for bringing up all the things that I'm gonna bring up in that one. I also need to figure out how I'm gonna censor this video, because there's a lot of things that I said that YouTube is not gonna like, but I had to name them and say them because it's part of what Superflat is. It's part of what it is when you look past the craze of purchasing all of these artworks and being obsessed with the way that Murakami became very rich. There's a lot of obsession with him because there's a lot of stockholding bros who are more artistically inclined, like they could be into design or architecture or some shit like that, and they love Murakami, of course, and they think that he is extremely good at what he's doing, which, I'm not here to criticize whether he's good at what he's doing as much as I'm here to tell you what he's doing. He is a little bit more confusing just because he's not so straight up terrible like the other guy. If you want to dive deeper into it, I would recommend the lecture that I'm going to link in the description. Tell me what you think. Tell me what kind of artists you want me to talk about, or what kind of art movements you want me to talk about in the future. We're going to be kind of jumping from individual artists to art movements to whatever, kind of jump through things. And maybe there's going to be a part 2 to this one where I might look into specific artists a little bit, talk about them specifically and about their artwork specifically in more detail, especially those that are kind of in the counter culture to those artists that I've talked about today. In any case, I'm sorry we didn't talk about Witch today. We'll talk about it next time, because this podcast is getting long. But also, tell me if you want me to do Witch and Winx in the same podcast. If you want me to, basically just tell me what you want me to talk about in regards to those shows, because I really want to talk about them more. I really like them and I feel very nostalgic about them, and I wanted a little bit of a nostalgia segment in terms of shows and whatever here on the podcast, where we can just talk about themes, characters, and whatever, instead of talking about their fashion as we do on my main channel. In any case, thank you so much for watching. I hope this wasn't too dense. I was trying really hard to kind of form my opinions in a way that would make sense. I hope it made sense, and I will see you next week with art from Wojnarowicz, New York artist. So, see ya.